first encounter, the world was not quiet when the humans arrived. It was alive with strange winds that whistled across wide plains and carried the echo of creatures whose voices seemed too large for the sky. The soil was red like iron and the air felt heavy as if every breath carried the weight of 1,000 untold secrets. The human settlement had been placed near the edge of the alien territory, where tall trees with silver bark rose like ancient towers, watching every movement of the newcomers. Among the colonists, fear was common. They had learned quickly that the natives of this world were not like any species known before. They were towering giants almost 8 feet tall, with limbs like carved stone and eyes that gleamed with a sharp light, as if they carried both strength and sorrow in equal measure. These giants moved with a silence that unsettled the humans, for their steps made little sound even when they crossed the stony ground. Their presence alone demanded caution, and most of the colonists avoided being anywhere near them. David was different from the others. He was young compared to many in the colony, but his eyes held a calm curiosity that rarely showed fear, while most men and women turned away when the giants passed. David often watched with quiet interest. He noticed details the others ignored: how the aliens held themselves with dignity, even when they carried no weapons; how they stood close to one another, as if tied by invisible threads of loyalty; and how they never spoke in haste. Every movement of theirs seemed to carry meaning, like gestures of an unspoken language. There was one giant who stood apart from the rest. His name, spoken in the rhythm of his people, was Ran. His figure was tall, even among his kind, his shoulders broad like a fortress, and his face marked by scars that seemed older than the settlement itself. Yet it was not his strength that drew David's attention, but rather the silence that surrounded him. Unlike the others, Ran often stayed at the edge of his tribe, his eyes always on the horizon, as if waiting for something lost to return. The colony whispered that he was dangerous. Some said he had fought battles too violent for human minds to understand. Others claimed he was cursed, and that even his own kind kept him at a distance. One evening, as the sun lowered, turning the plains into a sea of burning orange, David saw Ran standing alone. The wind tugged at the giant's dark hair, and the fading light painted his scarred face with shadows. The rest of the colonists had already retreated to the safety of their settlement walls, but David did not move. His heart carried a pull that refused to be ignored, while fear gripped everyone else. He felt a strange sense of calm. He stepped out from the gates and began walking slowly across the plain. Every step made his fellow humans call after him, though their voices trembled with disbelief. "What are you doing? Come back. Are you mad?" David kept walking. The giant noticed the movement and turned. His eyes were sharp like steel, catching fire, and for a moment, the air grew still. The distance between them closed with every step, and soon David stood before a being who towered above him by more than 3 feet. The silence was heavy, but David did not bow his head in fear. Instead, he raised his hand slowly in greeting, showing his empty palm, so there would be no mistake of threat. Ran's gaze lingered on the hand as if it were something strange and unfamiliar. His massive frame shifted, and he lowered his head slightly, bringing his sharp features closer to the human. Colonists watching from afar felt sure that this would end in disaster, for they could not a man so small standing before a giant without being crushed. Yet David did not step back. His breath was steady, though his heart beat with fierce energy. He held his hand higher, waiting for the choice to be made. For a long moment nothing happened. Then Ran stretched out his enormous hand, the size of a shield, and placed it near David's, though not touching it first. The difference in size was so great that it seemed absurd. One hand so fragile and human, and the other vast like the root of an ancient tree. But then, slowly, Ran lowered his palm until it met David's. The contact was brief, but it was enough for something unseen to pass between them. A message without words. The colonists gasped. David felt the warmth and strength of the giant's skin, and yet he also felt something deeper, not just power but restraint. It was as if Ran had chosen to let him live when he could have done otherwise. The hand withdrew and the silence deepened. Rand's eyes softened only slightly, but enough for David to understand that this moment was the beginning of something no one else dared to try. When David returned to the settlement, he was met with disbelief and anger. Some accused him of risking their fragile peace, others mocked his foolish bravery. Yet, David said nothing. He only remembered the look in Rand's eyes, that strange mix of weight and recognition. It was not friendship, yet not hostility. Either it was something unformed, but powerful, like a seed beneath the soil waiting for the right time to grow. That night, while the colony slept, David sat awake, staring at the stars. The winds whispered through the silver trees, carrying voices that no human tongue could translate. He thought of Rand standing alone beneath the fading sun, and he knew with a certainty that his life had already shifted. The others might see the giants as threats, but David felt that they were guardians of something greater, something waiting to be understood, and he believed that he was meant to be the one who reached across the endless space that divided their two worlds. The first bond had been made, not by words, not by promises, but by a simple touch of hands, between a human and an alien giant. The challenge of trust. The following days in the settlement were restless because everyone had seen what David had done, and they could not understand how a single man dared to walk up to an alien giant with no fear in his heart. Some called him brave, but most called him foolish and reckless. They believed he was playing with danger, and that sooner or later the giant would crush him without hesitation. The words carried weight among the colonists, for fear was a constant companion on this strange world. Yet David kept his silence. He knew there was more in that moment than what the others had seen. He had felt it in the stillness of Rand's touch, something that told him the giant had chosen not to harm him, but to acknowledge him. Every morning, David continued to watch the edge of the plains where the silver bark trees swayed like tall shadows, and every evening Rand appeared there again, as if bound by an invisible thread. They never spoke, not with words, but with the small movements of hands, the tilt of a head, or the long pauses of silence. David began to understand that silence was its own language among the giants. Their speech was rare and sacred, perhaps meant only for their own kind. Still, the way Rand lowered his gaze slightly whenever David approached was more than enough to tell him trust was beginning to take shape. The colonists grew uneasy at David's persistence. Some confronted him outside the gates, their faces tight with fear and anger. They warned him that he was inviting ruin to all of them, that if Rand grew impatient or hostile, even for a moment, the giant could destroy the fragile peace and drag the whole settlement into war. But David refused to step back. He told them that fear would only keep them prisoners in their own walls, and that someone had to prove these beings were not monsters, but people who carried their own hearts and burdens. His words found little welcome, and soon the others began to treat him as an outsider within his own colony, despite the scorn. David carried on. Each day he went to the plains where Rand waited, and each day the bond grew a little stronger. Sometimes Rand would trace patterns in the dirt with a massive finger, strange symbols of his people. David would kneel beside them, copying the marks with his smaller hand, trying to understand, and though he failed to grasp the meaning, Rand's quiet patience never faltered. Other times, David would bring small offerings, simple tools crafted by human hands, or food gathered from the settlement gardens. Rand accepted these with the still dignity of his kind, and once in return, he placed a fragment of carved stone in David's hands. The stone was etched with markings that shimmered faintly in the light, and David knew it was not a token given lightly. Yet the true test of trust did not come from gifts, but from fear. One late afternoon, a storm rose across the plains. Clouds boiled black and lightning tore open the sky. The colonists rushed inside their shelters, but David remained near the edge because Rand had not yet appeared. The wind screamed, and the silver trees bent low, and then through the storm, Rand emerged, his massive frame cutting through the rain. His eyes glowed faintly in the flashes of lightning, and he carried himself with the same silence, even as nature roared around them. David felt the instinct to run for shelter, but his feet held firm. Rand stopped only a few steps away, water streaming down his scarred face. He lifted his hand palm open, as if asking David to hold steady against the storm. David raised his own hand, though the wind nearly pushed him off his balance. In that moment he understood that Rand was testing him not with strength, but with endurance. The storm became a trial of trust. If David ran now, all would be broken. So he stood tall, rain stinging his eyes, thunder shattering the sky, yet his hand remained high, facing Rand's enormous palm. Through the torrent their eyes locked, and something shifted between them. A silent agreement stronger than words. When the storm passed, leaving the land soaked and steaming, Rand finally lowered his hand and gave a slow nod. For the first time David saw the faintest curve at the corner of the giant's mouth, not a smile as humans knew it, but something close enough to carry meaning. He had passed the trial. The bond was no longer a fragile thread, it was now a rope, thick and unyielding, woven through trust. But inside the settlement suspicion deepened. The leaders called David to their chamber and questioned him sharply. Why risk the lives of the many for the company of one giant? Why believe that these beings who tower above men with such strength could ever see humans as equals? David answered. With calm words, he said that fear blinds, and that if peace was to be real, it must be built on trust between individuals, before it could ever grow. Between nations, he told them that Rand had saved him from the storm, and that he believed the giant would stand beside him if danger ever came. The leaders were unconvinced, and some muttered that David was bewitched. That night, while David returned to his quarters, whispers followed him. Children peeked from corners with wide eyes as if he had touched something forbidden, and adults turned away as if his shadow carried danger. Yet he felt no regret. Instead, his thoughts returned to Rand, standing tall in the storm, and the way his silent nod had sealed a bond more powerful than the judgments of men. David knew he was walking a path alone, but he also knew that the path was leading somewhere greater than Fearin. The next dawn, Rand appeared earlier than usual, waiting with arms crossed and eyes sharp. He gestured for David to follow beyond the plains and into the deeper lands where no human had yet walked. The colony gates loomed behind David, heavy with suspicion, but his heart pulled him forward. He stepped past the familiar soil into the unknown, trailing beside the giant whose steps were steady and sure. He knew the path ahead would hold more trials and perhaps more danger, but within him burned a strange certainty that he was not walking into darkness but toward the light of something new, bond forged in adversity. The land beyond the silver bark trees stretched wide like a world without end. The ground rose into ridges and dipped into valleys filled with strange blue grass that glowed faintly at night. The air grew warmer the farther they walked, and David could feel the pulse of life hidden in every corner. Insects with crystal wings darted through the air, and shadows of massive beasts moved in the distance. Rand led with steady steps, never rushing, yet never hesitating, as if he had walked this path many times before. David followed with cautious eyes, but his heart held no fear, only curiosity, and the strange calm that always came when he was near the giant. Hours passed until the sun burned high, and then Rand stopped at the edge of a deep ravine. The walls of stone fell sharply into darkness, and a river of molten fire glowed below. The heat rose in waves, and David felt sweat gather on his skin. Rand gestured across the ravine, where a narrow path of natural stone stretched like a fragile bridge. Looked treacherous, but Rand stepped onto it without pause. His long legs carried him with balance, while his broad frame moved as though weight meant nothing. David hesitated only for a breath, then set his feet onto the same path. The stones were hot beneath his boots, and the air shimmered with heat. David kept his eyes fixed on Rand's back, letting the giant's calm steps guide his own. He realized that Rand had not brought him here without reason. Perhaps it was another trial of trust. Or perhaps there was something waiting beyond. The bridge narrowed, and the molten river below roared louder. David's knees trembled, but he pressed on. Finally, they reached the other side, and Rand turned, giving David another of those long, steady Looks as if measuring his strength, they moved forward into a hollow valley where the air was cooler and shadows thickened. It was quiet at first, but soon David noticed movement in the tall grass. Something shifted with heavy steps followed by the sound of low snarls. Ran raised his head and his body stiffened. David followed his gaze and saw shapes circling them. Beasts taller than a man with thick hides like armor and eyes that glowed red in the dim light. Their jaws opened wide, revealing rows of teeth meant for tearing flesh. David's breath caught, but he stood his ground. Ran stepped in front of him, his massive frame shielding the human from the advancing predators. The beasts moved closer, their snarls echoing through the valley. Then in a flash, one of them lunged. Ran's arm swung like a hammer, striking the beast aside with a force that shook the ground. Another beast leapt from the side, and Ran caught it midair, twisting its body and throwing it to the rocks. The fight had begun. David wanted to run, but his heart refused. He grabbed a sharp stone from the ground and pressed his back to the cliff wall. If Ran fought alone, the beasts would overwhelm him despite his strength. So when another creature rushed from behind, David threw the stone with all his force, striking the beast in the eye. It shrieked in pain, giving Ran the moment he needed to drive his fist into its skull. David knew his throw had not killed it, but it had helped, and that mattered. The battle raged. Ran's roars filled the valley, and his massive limbs crushed bones and split the earth underfoot. But even the giant could not be everywhere. At once, one beast slipped past his guard, charging straight toward David. Its teeth glistened as it leapt. David felt fear surge through him, but instead of falling back, he lifted a broken branch lying at his feet and thrust it forward with all his strength. The beast collided with him, knocking him hard against the wall, but the branch pierced into its mouth, slowing it long enough for Ran to reach them. With a thunderous strike, Ran crushed the beast to the ground, ending its threat. David coughed, struggling for breath, but when he looked up, Ran was there, towering above him with eyes blazing. The giant reached down, not to scold, but to pull him to his feet. His grip was firm but careful, as if handling something fragile. David realized then that he had done more than survive. He had fought alongside Ran, and in that fight something deeper had been forged. Their bond was no longer just silence and gestures. It was trust born in the heart of danger. Last of the beasts lay broken across the valley. Ran stood still, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, but his eyes never left David. Slowly he bent to the ground and picked up the broken branch David had used against the beast. He studied it for a long moment, then placed it back into David's hands, closing the human's fingers around it, as though declaring it a weapon of honor. The gesture spoke louder than any words. It was recognition. When they returned across the stone bridge, David felt different. He no longer followed Ran with hesitation. He walked beside him. Their steps, though unequal in length, carried the same rhythm, and David understood that the giant no longer saw him as a fragile outsider, but as a companion. The air between them was lighter, though. No words were exchanged back at the settlement. David's return with bruises and torn clothes drew alarm. The colonists demanded to know what had happened, and when he told them of the beasts and the battle, they stared in disbelief. Some accused him of lying, others whispered that no man could fight beside a giant and live. But Ran appeared soon after, his massive frame darkening the settlement gate. He carried with him the body of one of the slain beasts and dropped it before the humans. The truth lay in its heavy form. No one could deny what had been done. Fear spread, but so did awe. For the first time, the colonists saw Ran not as a looming threat, but as a protector, and they saw David standing beside him not as a reckless fool, but as someone who had earned the respect of a being far greater in strength than any man that night. David sat outside the walls, once more staring at the stars. Ran sat nearby, silent as always, but close enough that their shadows touched in the starlight. David felt the ache of his bruises, yet within that pain was pride. He had chosen not to run, and because of that choice, something powerful had been born. He knew there would be more trials ahead, and that both humans and giants would resist this bond. but the memory of the battle and the weight of Ran's hand lifting him to his feet would remain forever. It was no longer a question of bravery, it was a truth. He and Ran were bound now, not by words, but by blood and struggle. The suspense peaks the days after the battle in the valley brought a heavy silence to the colony. Because the people had seen what David and Ran had done together, and it unsettled them deeply. They whispered in corners and spoke in hushed tones, as if even the air might carry their words to the giant, who now walked closer to the human gates than ever before. Some voices were filled with awe, but more were filled with fear, for the idea of a bond between man and giant was too much for many to accept. They feared that Ran had chosen David not as a friend, but as a tool, and that one day he would use him to strike against the colony. The leaders met in secret chambers to discuss what should be done. Some argued that David should be forbidden from leaving the settlement. Others spoke of driving Ran away before his presence invited ruin. But no decision could silence the truth that the people had seen the giant fight to protect David, and that David had stood his ground in return. This truth carried weight even among those who doubted. And it began to divide the colony into two sides. One side believed in the bond and hoped it could grow into peace, while the other clung to fear and demanded distance. Meanwhile, Ran's own tribe had also taken notice. Word spread among the giants that one of their strongest had chosen to walk beside a human. For many this was unthinkable. They believed it was a dishonor that Ran lowered himself to the level of a smaller, weaker being. Some spoke with anger, saying that he had betrayed the pride of his kind. Others watched with caution, trying to understand what Ran saw in the human who dared to stand at his side. Ran himself gave no explanation. He met the judgment of his tribe with silence, just as he met the suspicion of the humans. With silence, his only answer was to continue walking to the edge of the plains each day, where David always met him. Bond grew stronger, yet the world around it grew restless. David could feel the weight pressing from both sides. His own people treated him like a stranger, and Ran's people watched him with sharp eyes that seemed to measure every breath. Still, David did not waver. He believed that what had been forged between him and Ran was real, and that it carried a meaning greater than any fear. Then the danger came from beyond the plains. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, the ground trembled with a force that shook the walls of the settlement. Shadows rose in the distance, vast shapes moving with speed and hunger. Unlike the beasts of the valley, these creatures were larger and more numerous. They surged across the horizon in a wave of black forms, their screeches splitting the air. The colonists cried out in terror, for they had never seen such a horde. Ran appeared at once, his giant frame standing tall at the gates, and when his tribe saw the threat, they too gathered in silence. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, both humans and giants knew that the danger was greater than their mistrust. The creatures struck like a storm crashing against stone. The colony walls shook under the weight of their assault. Their claws scraped against metal and their jaws snapped at any movement. David stood among his people, urging them to hold steady, while Ran's voice rose in a deep call that echoed like thunder, summoning his kind. The giants moved into the fray with massive strides, their arms swinging like living weapons, crushing the creatures with blows that broke the ground. Yet even their strength was tested, for the horde seemed endless. David fought as best he could with the broken branch Ran had given him still clutched in his hands. Though it was no blade, it carried meaning and gave him courage. He struck at any beast that broke through the defenses, and when his arms grew weak, he still stood unyielding. Ran fought near him, never far away, his enormous frame striking down enemies before they could reach the human. Together they moved as one, each guarding the other in a dance of survival. The colonists watched in shock as David fought beside the giant without fear. The sight unsettled them, but also filled them with a strange hope, for it was clear that without Ran and his tribe, the walls would have already fallen. Likewise, the giants saw Ran shielding a human with his own body, and they could no longer deny the truth that this bond was not weakness, but strength born of trust. The battle raged into the night with fire and screams lighting the dark sky. At one point, the creatures broke through a section of the wall and poured inside. The colonists panicked, running in every direction, but David did not run. He stood in the path with his branch raised, though his arms shook. Rand saw this and charged forward, his massive body slamming into the swarm. He struck with fury, his roars shaking the air, as he fought to protect the small man who refused to retreat. Together they forced the creatures back inch by inch, until the breach was sealed. When dawn finally rose, the land was littered with broken forms of the fallen beasts. The air smelled of smoke and blood, and the people stood weary but alive. The giants had fought with a power no human could deny, and the humans had shown courage that the giants could not ignore yet. At the center of it all stood David and Ran, their bodies scarred, their breath heavy, but their bond unbroken. Their unity had held the line when both sides would have fallen apart. Silence fell across the battlefield. As both tribes looked upon them, no words were spoken, but the truth was clear. Suspicion still lingered, but something greater had been revealed. They had stood against the same storm, and had survived only because of each other. That night the fires burned low, and the stars shone bright. David sat on the wall, his hands aching and his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Rand sat nearby, his massive form resting, but his eyes still sharp. The colony watched from a distance. The tribe of giants too watched, yet neither dared to disturb them. David looked to Rand, and Rand returned the gaze with calm, steady eyes. No words were needed. The bond that had begun with a touch of hands had now been tempered in fire and blood. The suspense had reached its highest peak, for both humans and giants knew a choice would soon come. Either they would accept this bond and allow it to guide them into a new path, or they would reject it and fall back into fear. The battle had shown what was possible, yet fear still lingered like a shadow, waiting to strike resolution and ending. The morning after the great battle came heavy with silence. The sun rose slow and red across the plains, painting the broken land with a strange beauty. The air still carried the bitter smell of smoke, and the ground bore scars where fire and claws had torn through the soil. The colonists moved quietly, tending to the wounded and gathering what little could be repaired, while the giants stood watch like statues, their tall forms outlined against the light. For the first time in living memory, both sides stood not as strangers, but as survivors of the same storm. David walked slowly among his people, his body bruised but his spirit unbroken. Everywhere he passed, eyes followed him. Some still held fear, but many now carried something different, something close to respect. They had seen him stand when others would have fled, and they had seen him fight beside the giant who had once been the source of their greatest unease. The whispers were no longer only of doubt. Some spoke with admiration, others with wonder, and though no one said it openly, they all knew the truth. The colony was alive because one man had dared to trust an alien giant. Ran walked near him, his steps steady, though his body bore deep wounds. The scars on his skin were fresh, but his eyes were calm. The other giants watched him with the same careful silence. They had always given, but now there was a shift in their gaze. They no longer saw only betrayal. In his bond with the human, they saw strength proven in battle. They had witnessed him shield the small man with his own body, and they had seen the small man strike with courage beyond his size. What had seemed impossible had become undeniable later. That day the leaders of the colony gathered outside the gates where the giants had assembled. A space was made between them, broad and silent. The people waited, their faces pale with tension, for they knew this moment would decide whether fear would return or whether something new would begin. David stepped forward, carrying the broken branch that Rand had once placed in his hand. Its surface was scarred from the battle, but he held it high for all to see. He spoke not with long speeches, but with simple words. He said that trust was not weakness, that fear had nearly destroyed them, and that only by standing together had they survived. He told them that Rand was not his enemy, nor his master, but his companion, and that what they had built In silence and in battle could guide them all if they had the courage to follow. The words echoed across the plain, and for a long moment no one answered. Then Rand stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow over David. He bent low, bringing his hand once more to meet David's as he had on that first day. The gesture needed no translation. The people saw it for what it was, a bond between two beings so different in form yet equal in spirit. Rand's tribe watched in silence, and then, one by one, a few of them stepped forward, placing their hands over their chests in the sign of honor. Their acceptance was quiet, but powerful. The humans stared wide-eyed, and slowly some lowered their weapons and bowed their heads. The wall of fear that had divided them cracked. The choice was no longer in the hands of leaders alone. It lived in the hearts of every witness. The battle had proved the bond real, and now the sight of giant and human standing side by side sealed it. The colony and the tribe would not change overnight, but the seed had been planted, and no one could deny it any longer. In the days that followed, humans and giants began to move closer. The Pongdude colonists repaired their walls with the help of the strong hands of the giants, while the giants accepted food and water from human hands that no longer trembled. Children watched wide-eyed as Rand lifted heavy stones as if they were pebbles and placed them gently where David directed. Women carried supplies without fear, walking side by side with towering figures who once had been shadows of dread. The world had shifted, and though mistrust still lingered, it no longer ruled. For David and Rand, life changed too. They no longer met only at the edge of the plains. They walked openly through both camps, drawing the eyes of all, but now with less suspicion and more curiosity. Each step they took together was a reminder of what had been won. David learned more of Rand's silent language, small gestures and carved symbols, and Rand listened to David's simple words, even if he never replied aloud. Their bond grew not from need, but from choice, and it became something deeper than either had expected. One evening, as the sun set gold across the land, David sat on the wall of the settlement, staring at the endless horizon. Rand stood beside him, his arms crossed, his gaze steady on the same distance. They did not speak, but the silence between them was full of meaning. David thought back to the day he had first stepped across the plain, while others shouted for him to turn back. He thought of the storm, the valley, the beasts, and the night of fire. He thought of the fear he had carried, and the courage that had grown in its place. He turned his eyes to Rand and found the giant already watching him. In that gaze was recognition, not of a subject, not of a weaker creature, but of an equal and a friend. The colony had not chosen David to be their bridge. He had chosen himself. He had walked the path when none else dared, and because of that a bond had been forged that no fear could break. It was not written in treaties nor carved in stone, but lived in the hearts of two beings who had seen each other not as enemies, but as companions. It was a bond of trust, of blood, and of courage. The night fell, quiet, stars rising in the dark sky. The people of the colony settled into rest, and the tribe of giants returned to their camp. Yet at the wall, a man and a giant remained. Their shadows stretched long across the earth, bound together as one. In that silent watch, the future of two peoples began, not with words, not with promises, but with a bond born of bravery. The story of David and Rand would be told again and again, not as a tale of war, but as a tale of courage and trust, for he was the only human brave enough to bond with an 8-foot alien giant, and because of that bravery, two worlds found the path to stand together. The end.